From the Glucksman Library at the University of Limerick, Head of Journalism Mary Dundon in conversation with Gerry Curran, Chairperson of the National Union of Journalists Ireland and Media Relations Advisor for the Irish Court Service.
Good afternoon everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to our third Current Issues in Irish Media seminar series. Our speaker today is Gerry Curran, who is the Irish Court Service Media Relations Advisor. He's been the Media Relations Advisor to the Irish Court Service for the past 13 years. And in that time he has built up a good working relationship with journalists all over the country. His job is to promote the work of the Court Service and explain the operations of the courts, provide information on many court cases every day, and he also advises the judiciary on their approach to media stories and the coverage of matters judicial. The Court Service deals with over 10,000 media inquiries every year. As well as holding a master's degree in journalism, Gerry has a law degree and holds 2 further master's degrees in both criminology, industrial relations and human resources management. He's currently studying and researching a PhD in public policy and law. He's also the current chairman of the National Union of Journalists in Ireland, which you will all find very interesting because, again, you're all going to be members of the NUJ when you go out working in journalism. And this gives him further access to reporters and newsrooms' views and issues from across the country. He's the only person to ever be re-elected to this position. He has previously worked as a newspaper reporter and as a television presenter and reporter for RTE. In a previous career, Gerry worked as a social care worker in places of detention and the courts, especially liaising between the courts and children in custody. He continues his involvement in community and socially progressive groups as an outside interest to his work and studies. In his presentation today, he will trace the parallel development of court reporting with that of the nation state and the courts, and the business and operational environment of modern media. I'd like you to give him a warm welcome.
Now, what's that with there?
Okay. Am I blocking this? Can you see? Yeah.
There we go. Oh, good afternoon. Glad you could be here. The PowerPoint that I've given out for you has everything that I need to say on it, and I'm also going to email Mary a link to a paper I wrote some years back that covers all the detail of what I'm not going to say today. I thought I was coming out to give you a 2-hour lecture, but seemingly I'm limited to 30 minutes on discussion. I'm only messing, it's far too democratic for me. I'm only messing. So what I'll do is, I think what's best is, I'll go halfway through what I was going to say, then have a discussion, and then go back to maybe other parts of what I was going to say.
Yeah. I
suppose in explaining the courts, you do elements of law and court as part of your legal degree. The fact you're here, by the way, let me start by doing this just. The fact that you're here puts you in the top 7% of educated people in the world. And just remember that now. 93% of people in the world are roughly, and you've no way of checking this, so I can make up the figure if I want. But roughly speaking, 93% of people in the world aren't as educated as you. If you get your bachelor's degree from here, you'll be in the top 7 or 8%. If you do your master's here, you'll be in the top 5%. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is not only are you privileged to be here, not only are you being given a great boost in life towards doing what you want to do with journalism, but it means you will probably succeed as a journalist, and it will affect the type of journalist that you will become. You will, regardless of your background, become middle class, social democratic mostly, Western European, slightly liberal. Because they don't really teach Nazism in Irish colleges, much. Do you know what I mean? We don't do despotism too bad, or much. But what you're getting is a liberal arts education in a Western European university. That makes you very lucky, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. It makes you a certain type of person. And that's going to infect or influence or make better the type of journalist that you are. So that's my starting point. The second thing is, I want to ask a few questions. That's nothing to do with this. Is there anyone, besides us two, is there anyone here married? Now you don't have to answer these, just try to think about them. If someone wants to jump up and say I'm married, great. Is there anybody here married? Just think about that for a second. Is there anyone here black? Just think about that for a second. Is there anyone here with extremist views on religion, for or against it? Think about that. Is there anyone here gay? Think about that. Is there anyone here with terminal cancer? Think about that. Now, I don't care the answers to all those questions. The reason I'm saying them is you can never assume anything about any group or any individual. Any group of people, any individual, by looking at them. You all seem nice, bright and healthy and alive and together. One of you could be terminally ill for what I know. And this as much should inform your journalism as it should inform court reporting. You can never assume, when you're looking at someone, their guilt or their innocence. We could spend the next 20 minutes talking about a wedding fair and everyone getting excited about someone getting married, and there could be someone tortured about their sexuality or being bullied about their sexuality, because it seems that happens with kids. We could be talking about someone and slag them off over getting a spray tan and saying, well, why would you be bothered if you're black anyway? Because that was actually said by a journalist online recently. Now, I don't know the chap's name. He got a gold, silver medal in the Olympics for the Brits in gymnastics. Really fit guy in the Olympics. Some of you must know his name. Anyway. Last year, GB, he won a magnificent gold medal. He's after coming back now, he's after getting his body all fit again because the Daily Mail were slagging him over getting a beer belly. And he's after coming back, and he was showing off his body a few weeks ago in a selfie, and he's giving it all that. And he titled it after getting spray tan. Now he has a facial shape that you'd think he's from a Middle Eastern background or something like that. And a journalist in England said, why bother, she are black anyway? And the journalist spent the next week apologising, because he's not. He might be slightly less than white, or slightly more colourful than white, but he doesn't describe himself as black. He doesn't see himself culturally or ethnically as being black. So we can't assume what we see is what we get about people, about groups of people, and most importantly about individuals. That's particularly the case in court reporting. Just because someone is in court doesn't mean they did anything wrong. Just because somebody has an addiction look after them doesn't mean they're a junkie. Because they're in a tracksuit bottoms doesn't mean they're a scumbag. Because they're wearing a suit certainly doesn't mean that they're innocent. Just because someone came from a private education, or at least has an accent that they may well have done so, doesn't mean that they're any less likely to have been involved in an act of dishonesty than those who came from a more humble background. So, people ask me what your approach to journalism is. Then you're like, my starting point to every journalist's story is, don't accept anything on face value, and don't judge anybody by what you see at first, because you can assume nothing. That's not down in the notes, that was just to start myself off. Right. As regards the media and the courts, I'm going to do the first two first, give you an overview of media and what makes news, and then give you a history of court reporting to some extent. Then I'll talk to you whatever way you want, and then I'll go into how you guys in the media actually cover crime in courts. There's been a good bit of research done on that, and I've just completed some of my own research. And the trick if you're doing research for anything like that is to go back a few years. If you're doing that in political or court or legal, till all matters settle. So I did my studies on in 2007, a couple of weeks, because it's settled and we know the outcome. And most people are dead who were involved in it, so it's grand, so you can't lie to them. But anyway, and then we talk about the Media Relations Service. The most important thing I think about the courts in Ireland, as opposed to other countries, is that they are held in public. The Constitution guarantees that all courts are held in public, except where the law says different. We take that for granted as citizens, because it's just the way it's always been in your living memory. There are countries in the world where courts are not held in public. Where when Saddam Hussein was being tried in Iraq, There was one journalist allowed in from one news agency to report to the rest of the world. I'm sure he did a very objective and decent job, but he could have been crap at his job. He could have been bought off. He could have been threatened. He could have been lied to. He could have been a dumbass that just didn't understand what was going on. I don't know. He seems to have done a good job. So we take it for granted that we're going to have courts and open, but we shouldn't. But the fact that we don't live in a city-state, we say like in Athenian times, we've all seen that movie 300 and them type of Greek movies, with the city-state, little Mickey Mouse King and beautiful wife and all that. And they all go out into a square in Athens, and they all have their court on a Thursday afternoon with 2,000 on the jury, and they have a great time. Now the difference between them and us is that we all have to work. They had slaves to do their bidding. Only the citizens went, not the slaves. And they had nice weather. Could you imagine standing out last week out there now outside on the hill where the funny bridge is, having a court and 2,000 of you on the jury panel? Those of you who survived and went into Shannon might have come to a decision very quickly and justice might have been served. But we don't have a city-state. So people don't go to courts. The general public rarely go to courts because we have busy lives and we have things to do. So that makes what you do as journalists vital in bringing about an understanding of the decisions of the courts. The courts don't have an army. The courts don't have their own police force. The courts very rarely have to enforce their orders in Ireland because there's a general acceptance with some major criticisms, and rightly so in a democracy, of the decisions of a court. But it's the role of the media as the eyes and the ears of the public to report faithfully what happens in court and to help people, through fact, understand what goes on in courts. As you know, there's 3 branches of government. Can I ask what they are? Come on, you're university students.
The Oireachtas, the Shannon, and the Dáil.
That's one. All that together is one. We call that the Oireachtas. Second one? Judiciary is the third. Yeah, there's one in between. What? No, that's the Oireachtas. The executive. Right, so you've got the Oireachtas, which is the Shannon, the Dáil, and the President Higgins. The 3 of them together are called the Oireachtas. They have all the power to make laws. The executive is traditionally was only regarded as the cabinet, but it's not. It's anyone who can actually make decisions based on a law passed by the Oireachtas. So government ministers have huge powers, statutory instruments, ministerial orders, executive powers. So that's why it's called the executive. But so has the city manager, so has the county manager. So has senior permanent civil servants. That's why they call the civil service the permanent government. They have extraordinary powers. And then in Ireland, as in England, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, common law countries, what's generally described as the third arm, accurately it should be said, one of the 3 arms of government is the judiciary. The Chief Justice has described it as the weakest arm of government because it doesn't raise its own budgets, because it can't describe new laws, but it acts as a fulcrum. That's the needle on a weighing scale, so the scales of justice, the fulcrum of balance, the little needle between the citizen and the state. That's its role. And when I hear journalists, or I hear people ringing into radio shows, or I hear criticisms across the media saying, oh, the judge was all about the defendant, I'm delighted. Because it means the judge is doing his job. Because, right, all of ye would say, to this point in your life, have no criminal records. There I am assuming. Right? I assume you don't. All of ye will, at some stage, work away. You might work in New Zealand or Australia or the States or Canada. You need a visa to work in them. If you even have a conviction for stealing an apple or a sandwich, that becomes impossible. So when you're arrested for stealing the apple or for being drunk and forgetting to pay for the sandwich out of the spar shop on a Friday night out somewhere, you have yourself and your reputation going into court. Ireland, who prosecutes you, not the owner of the shop, Ireland has its full resources to prove your guilt. And those resources are a state prosecutor, the Garda Síochána, fingerprint evidence, forensic science. No, I mean, they may not use that just over the sandwich, but just, you'd never know. I've seen worse. They can sequester and use CCTV. They can compel witnesses to stand up and speak against you by summoning people. The full spectrum of the resources of the state is available to Ireland when they prosecute you on your own with whatever solicitor you can afford, and if you can't afford one that the state gives you, thankfully there is good on both sides because they're the same people. So the judge's job, first and foremost, is to make sure you get a fair trial. So it's only fair and it's only correct under our law that she should be all about you. Now, if you're found guilty anyway, then he might turn on you and say a few nasty things and give you a sentence or a fine or whatever. But until you're proven guilty, the judge has to balance up your weakness and vulnerability against the might of the state. That's his job. That's what the courts are there to do. And it's important that the media cover it. Now, you might ask, why do certain things make the news and certain things not? On an average day last year in the CCJ, we call it, the Criminal Courts of Justice in Dublin, where there are 22 courts, and they hear nothing else but crime. There's about 1,650 cases a day go through there, right? Roughly, you need to take it down because it could be making it up. It's probably less this year, but roughly speaking, there was about that last year. Only 10 would make it into the national newspapers the next day, and on Sundays only 5. So what makes them stand out from the other 1,645 that didn't make it? What made the poor 5 defendants in those cases, the unluckies? I was going to say bastards, but the camera's on, so I said it anyway. The unlucky buggers who ended up in the newspaper. Now, obviously, the seriousness of the crime or a novelty factor involved in the crime might do it. Like, if you have 300 people up on a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday on public order, threatening abusive behaviour, intoxication in a public place, generally misdemeanours, generally dealt with by way of a fine or a poor box or a warning or something like that, and the 300 cases don't get into the paper, even locally, only 4 or 5 do. What's the standout? The fact that she stood underneath the window reciting sonnets from Shakespeare to his girlfriend to get her back might make it stand out. Or he flung a full can of Club Orange at the garage unopened and bounced off his head. That might just make it stand out from the others. Or he fell out of the taxi face first into the gutter or whatever. Or got into the back of the car and asked him to take him to Glanmire because he thought it was a taxi. Them little things might just get you into the paper. But the list I have there is actually what you use with every story you ever approach, or what newspapers use and television and radio use to actually decide what makes to the front page, what stories get covered, what stories don't. So an event of importance. The fact that I'm here today will not be on the television tonight. If I killed one of you, it might be. Right? But it's not necessarily, not every murder makes the front page anymore. There was one murder a few years ago, 2007, it took them 3 weeks to report it in a national newspaper. Because it was a homeless guy down in Carlow, and he wasn't from the local area, no one could identify him for ages. But I mean, it was getting that much, if it was getting anything. And eventually it made it, because there was a link to a vicar or something like that, eventually. So an event of importance. So the GSOC bug in this week is all over the place. The fact that GSOC went about its work as per normal 3 weeks ago never made the papers. The fact that they think, or they're saying that they think, that they may have been bugged, has become very important. And more so important because of the way it was handled or mishandled by a lot of people. I can't have a view on the actual thing because that will end up in court. So I can't take a view on it. But when we're finished and we can discuss the way it was handled from a PR point of view, maybe later on. Something that's interesting, exciting and entertaining. Now wait till we think. Kylie Minogue. Every time they used to put her in the late 80s, middle to late 80s into the early 90s, when she was in her first incarnation. She was a skinny, attractive, lovely looking young one, and she used to wear these things that were no more than bathing suits with sparkles on them, and that was her outfit, and high heels on the stage. Every time the Star, the Mirror, the Sun, the Sunday World put her on the side, the right hand side of the front page, with her legs going down the side of it, even though she's tiny, their sales went up 7 to 10%. Because there was a level of titillation involved. Most boys will be buying the paper anyway for the sport. You get extra boys buying it for the bit of titillation. You might get girls buying it because they liked her, because she was a teenage hero at the time, all them years back. You might get the gay fellas buying it because they like pop music, stereotypically according to the market researchers, and they love Kylie. So newspapers go for markets and they stereotype people. So they have to see what's interesting, exciting and entertaining. Madeleine McCann, every single time, 5 years on, that she's on the front page of an Irish newspaper, the tabloid particularly, their sales go up 9%, I'm told. Right? So you might wonder why that story's still running 5 years on. Because most people, when they're lost, they get forgotten after 5 years. Why it's still running? Newspapers know, down to the, particularly since they went online, they know exactly what type of reader likes what. Now it's something that's fresh and in the immediate past. The fact that there was, I don't know, what can we think? The fact that 2 people were killed illegally, it seems, over the weekend in different parts of the country made the newspapers because it happened over that weekend. They wouldn't start reporting that on the Wednesday, they wouldn't keep it. It has to be something that's fresh, that's immediate, that's a record of what happened yesterday. Dramatic and open to personalisation, and this is why court stories make it. And I'll give you a business example. In the 1960s and right into the 70s, business stories never made the front pages in Irish newspapers because they were boring, because nobody owned anything. Ireland was basically a tenant country. We rented houses, we rented farms, we sold our labour on a temporary basis to big employers. There weren't private pensions, people didn't have shares, people didn't have mortgages. So business didn't really, it wasn't very dramatic because it was quite boring, because there was a very period of ease from the 30s and after the war. It was very small growth, there was nothing major. And no one could personalise business stories because no one owned anything, bar the top 5%. Moving into the 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they started appointing business correspondents. RT appointed its first business correspondent in the 70s because of the oil crisis. People who owned countries, who owned oil, decided that they weren't producing too much and the price shot up. In Ireland that meant electricity shot up because most of our electricity production was oil-based. Probably still is, but it certainly was then. Factories couldn't afford to run, people couldn't afford to keep on electricity, there were power cuts, there were queues outside Maxall stations. It was a huge story, and the reason for it was business. And business ended up on the front page regularly from that day on. And we move it straight forward to the crash of 2007, 2008, Anglo-Irish Bank, the bankruptcy of the country. 50-something% of people in Ireland don't have a private pension, but the rest have some sort of a pension. And in my case, they just take money out of my bank every week, and I don't know where it goes. My only instruction was it would be put into ethical, so trade union labour and non-arms. I didn't want to go into arms or nuclear power sort of stuff. So it's a middle risk pension plan that only will go to trade union labour because I'm a trade unionist, blah, 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 blah. And that's all I know about it. And every year they get back to me saying, you paid in a few grand, and we added an extra few grand up. But I got one in 2008 that says, you now have half in the account that you actually paid in, never mind what you made. Every single person in the country with a private pension plan was wiped out by between 40 and 50%. Right? That meant that business stories were thrown onto the front page of national newspapers and are still there. The interest in the Anglo trial is extraordinary compared to the actual charges. I can't talk about them because it's before the court. But the charges aren't murder. They are whatever they are, and they carry a maximum of 2-year sentence. The extraordinary application by the media and the resources to it, because what happened was dramatic and open. Everyone could feel it. Everyone who had 5 pence in the bank felt it. So that made that news. It's attributable and close proximity, right? Close proximity is, no, I'll leave that last. Attributable. I'm quoted in the Irish Times today, a spokesman for the court service said, that made that story more important than if they had picked it up as a bit of gossip. So you start off with rumour, then it goes up to gossip, then it goes up to, we'd say, a background source, then it goes up to a source close to, then it's a spokesman, and then it's the person themselves. So the Chief Justice is my boss. It would be, yesterday, Chief Justice Susan Denham said, if she's not saying that in the record, I might say, on her behalf, I might say the Chief Justice is very concerned about this matter, whatever the matter might be, or the Chief Justice wants to express her delight that this worked out well. That's not as good as her saying it. And then a source, everyone knows it's still me, but it's not as important. So there's a scale of attributability. That higher up the grade you can go to get an on-the-record quote, the more likely it is that that story be used. And when it gets to, we understand is the lowest you can go to really. Anything after we understand is just gossip. We understand means you were told by someone officially, but they won't go on the record. But you can't say people around town are thinking and sell it as a news story. That's tittle-tattle. And you'll often hear people like me, when you ring up, I'd say, come back to me when you think you've got something. I don't deal in tittle-tattle. Because otherwise I get nothing done. Now, close proximity is nearly as important as anything else. Now, if two of you, let's say, drowned in the river out there today, it would be in the, what's that, the Limerick Voice or the Limerick Leader tomorrow. Really, it would, wouldn't it? Particularly if we got a photograph of either your body's being fished out of water, or three of your colleagues crying and hugging each other. The more emotion, the better. And that sounds a bit cynical and a bit cold. That's the way newspapers make decisions, every day. Because remember, something like 98% of stuff that comes into newsrooms is never used. So these are cold, calculated things. What's going on there? These cold, calculated things, coming up, should come up now. A lot of the time have to do with proximity. If two people were drowned off the coast of New Zealand today, it wouldn't be in the Limerick Voice tomorrow, and it wouldn't be in the Limerick Leader. It's too far away. We don't know them. We can't get to fill up the picture of their family. No one who buys the paper knows their family. But if two Limerick people were killed in New Zealand, it might be in the paper, but not as big as if you were drowned in the Shannon there and we were able to get a picture of your body. I use it as an example because the Guardian in England used to be called the Manchester Guardian, and they have a definition of news that they still use today. So you're going to write this like a little formula, as if you're doing it in the other. So it's N equals, and then above the line, BK over DFM. So N equals BK over DFM. Remember, it's an English newspaper. It was based in Manchester, and it's that news equals Britons killed, so the number of British people killed, over the distance from Manchester. Right? Crude, extraordinary, very effective, and still used today. That's how one court story gets reported and thousands of others don't. That filter, I think you might call it, that filter is what brings it in. So basically, when you're saying, what is news? It's something that has happened, or didn't happen when it should have, but it's an event that should or should not have happened, or yet to happen, that someone somewhere does not want reported, and everything else is PR, basically, right? Wasn't it PR when you announced the Limerick City of Culture? And wasn't it news when it all went belly up in terms of who was working for it or not? And I won't say anything else about that because it could end up in court. But it's a good example. It was definitely PR when I announced the €140 million investment in the criminal courts of justice at the Phoenix Park in Dublin. And a stunning success it was. It was news on day 3 of that building process when yellow smoke started rising from the ground, and I got a phone call from the Sunday Independent to ask, why is there a mushroom cloud above the Phoenix Park? Because it used to be a match factory, it used to be an ammunition factory, and there was sulphur. So we had to close down what they described as a quarter of the city, a road. And there was all hassle, and the army disposal team came along, and they kicked to the ground. Yeah, give her a good rake and it's natural, it won't kill you. Sort of thing, that was CSI Ireland. Sort of thing. And it was grand. So I mean, so there's 2 examples, Joe. Limerick City Culture, PR, news. me saying, look at our glorious granite-filled new building that we're going to build, and then half the city, according to the paper, coming to a standstill. That's the difference. And that's why court stories make it all the time into newspapers. Because they are events that people would rather have not happened and would rather they be kept quiet. Now, how you approach those stories depends on the type of journalist that you are. And this is what I said to you at the beginning. You are going to be middle class. You're going to be irredeemably middle class because of your level of education, because of how you earn your money, because of the type of money you earn, and probably the way you spend your money, regardless of your background. If you're from an upper class, aristocratic background from England, tough, you just come down a few pegs. The fact that you have a job means you're common, right? Whatever. I pride myself on having an extraordinarily working class background. I can't, with any credibility, describe myself as working class anymore. Culturally, I probably am, but the same definition, how I earn my money, the type of money I earn, how I choose to spend my money, really doesn't make me working class. If I missed next week's paycheck, would I be bankrupt? No. If you're still in a situation where, yes, that would bankrupt you, well then you're still working class. That's the only difference really. But everyone aspires to be middle class anyway. And this will affect how you approach stories. Right. You're not reporting. The man walked into the room, the man sat down, the lights were on, it was windy outside, and he started to speak. When you write a report and we say this was a court hearing or this, you're going to pick something from it, think is news, that you found objectionable, that you found exciting, that you found challenging, or whatever. So you're going to create a social construct. You're going to construct some sort of a product that hopefully people will read long enough to notice the ad for Power City on the page that's going to pay your wages. So how you approach it depends on your owner. RTE approach stories very differently than 98 FM. The Irish Times approached them very differently from the journal.ie. I don't need to say more except who you work for colours the way you do your stories. If this wasn't in film, I'd give you great, probably slanderous stories about owners and editors in newspapers. I'll do it another time. The type of medium. Obviously radio covers court stories much more quickly, much more concisely than a two-page analysis in a broadsheet. That's going to affect how you construct your story. The process is used. It used to be, you better hurry up, this is on the page with colour. That has to go to press first, that sort of thing. But what end of the news you're on? Are you the lead story on 6-1, or will you come in just before the sport? If you're the middle section of the newspaper, that probably has to get printed before the outside. So, whatever. So that really will reflect how you approach any story, but also court stories. The type of journalist you are, I told you already about your middle classism. The fact of being educated is different. Before our generation, the generation before mine, you were trained on the job as a journalist. You went into a local paper, you trained for 4 years, copy boy, a runner, all sorts of stuff. And after about 7 years, you were probably made a proper senior journalist, or whoever. And if you did that well, you went to a national. Now, you won't get in the front door for an interview without a degree from a university or a college. Whether that's better or worse, I don't know, but it's the fact. You won't get in the front door. When I interview, and I often interview journalists for other organisations or for different types of jobs, I have to be very blunt. What do they call it in golf? The cut after the first 2 days or whatever, into the second 2 days. The cut is done, sorry, no education. They have to have that. Now, there's difference after that is experience and effort, that you put some effort into it. Your relationship with power and your target audience, need I mention target audience, except to say, that's always going to decide what story makes it into a paper, or what court case makes it into a paper and what doesn't. But the relationship with power is extraordinary. If you are an education correspondent, and you rely on the Department of Education to feed you stories and to do FOIs for you quickly and to get information to you and to back up other stories for you every day of the week, when they make bags of something, which everyone does, every government department, every agency in the world, every school, every business, every chocolate factory in the world makes mistakes. when they make a mistake, you cannot really have a full lash go at them and call them incompetent or agents and completely lambaste them, because you have to go back to them tomorrow for the story that you need. Now, if you are outside that loop and you're put on it, you might well be able to do it on the proviso that your education correspondent might be affected if you go too far. But if you are the education correspondent, you may well be curtailed in how strong you can go on a story because of your relationship with power. And power there is information or access to it. And that means the press office or the minister. Same with the courts. The guys covering the courts every day would not do the same sort of story as someone who never covers the courts if we made a mistake. Because they have to look at me tomorrow. They have to put up with my attitude towards them tomorrow.
What would be your advice be to students if somebody rang you up and said, you know, you had a bit of information, you said, well look, I'm telling you this off the record. What would your advice to students be? To respect that off the record or to go for the jugular? But just from working...
If it's off the record, it's off the record.
Yeah.
You never work again if you break something that's off the record, because the likes, people in my job would spend the rest of their energy on telling everyone in the business that you can't be trusted. Right? And I'll give you an example in a second. Right. Although, the way I look at it is, it used to warn us, everything's on the record unless you make it clear it's not. No, it's not like that anymore. When you're dealing with people in positions of information office, the way the journalist I deal with is, everything's off the record until I specify it's on. I do the opposite. And when I get to know a journalist, I could talk to you for 3 hours and you can't choose a word of it, except as background, as a quote, unless I tell you it's on the record. But that's a working relationship. But let me get back to you with this one. So let's say you can't do that. You won't, and the reason what you do is you report they made the bags of something, but you give them a good fair airing to explain why it happened, how it happened, say sorry, and why it won't happen again. If they're doing their job well, they can do that. And you, as that correspondent with the relationship with education or the military or horse racing or the courts or whatever your beat is, will give the person a fairer go at explaining themselves because of your need for them tomorrow. Now, if you don't need them, you can be fairer, but when we go to the questions, the first thing I do, someone remind me of Tasmanian Devil when we turn that off and go to questions. So what you're doing is you're distilling something, you're mediating, hence the name media, right? You're mediating something for the public about what happened yesterday, and yet you're still required to be objective and fair, and it can well be said that you are being. Now, so we come to crime and we come to courts, very simply. Newspapers thrive when they can highlight deviancy. What goes against the norm? What is a threat to society? What will cause a fear in people? What could stir up a debate? What could cause worry? And there's a term a criminologist came up with in the late 60s called moral panic. And it was about fights between moths and rockers in Brighton every Sunday afternoon, where they'd all go down from London, take 3/4 of an hour on their mopeds and bikes, and they'd knock the bejesus out of each other on the promenade in Brighton every Sunday afternoon. And the Women's Institute and the local Tory council and everyone else thought the world was coming to an end, civilization as we know it is terrible, and they stirred it all up. And this criminologist came up with the term, the newspapers and conservatives are creating a moral panic. Newspapers still do that. They still do it constantly.
Some newspapers.
Yeah, but I think all of them are capable of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, some of them do it having a go at what they call the establishment, some of them do it having a go at what they call deviance. But either way, newspapers are not printed so as everyone will feel good about themselves and agree by reading it. They're there to cause social division, debate and worry. For example, then, when they're doing about crime, they can start calling for more police on the ground, resources. It gives them influence. It sells papers. And what I told you earlier about the reliance on power official sources, in the area of crime and the area of courts and all that, it reinforces particular perceptions of crime. Any study that was done throughout the world about the perception of crime is that it's usually hugely informed by the media. Public conscience is. There's no doubt that that's usually informed by the vested interests in crime. One of the biggest vested interests in the area of crime is the police force anywhere in the world. Where there's calm, you don't get extra money thrown into the Gardaí or the police or the Garda Ombudsman or the courts, anywhere in the world. Where there is trouble, like you'll find in Ukraine today, the budget for the guards are gone up a few bob compared to last year. Do you know what I mean? And you'll find, even if it wasn't as serious and as horrible as it is, the situation, if newspapers were stacking it up, and the year before an election, every year before an election is due in Ireland, newspapers start emphasising crime, because the opposition starts doing it. It's one of the key areas where people stir up moral panic. And yet, as a criminologist, I can say to you, we live in an extraordinarily safe and low crime society. And that there were just as many people killed 100 years ago as there are now. But we used to call it a revolution then. Our history books tell us it was called a rebellion. It wasn't called a rebellion at the time, except for the few poets involved in it. To the general population and the newspapers, it was civil unrest. It was lawlessness. It was the murder of the lovely policeman outside the GPO, who everyone knew. They became heroes for lots of other reasons afterwards. But at the time, the moral panic was that society was falling apart, that a gang of socialists in the citizen army and poets in the other crowd got together and burned the post office or whatever happened. But that's the way one person's rebellion is another person's lawlessness. And that's the way newspapers create this whole almost quagmire of misunderstanding, or cloud around it. And I always argue that the reliance on official sources is in some way sort of skews the way crime is reported. The combination of all of that, basically. I'm going to go back because I said I'd finish on this one.
There's plenty of time, Gerry.
No, I mean I finished
Sure.
this part. Yeah. So basically, if you look at the front page of some newspapers, crime is the biggest story above any others through much of our recent history. Now you might argue business is the last 4 or 5 years, but that's an anomaly really. But crime and drugs together, like if you look at the Evening Herald, and if you look at the year 1996, crime was the biggest story, drugs was the second biggest story, and of the 10 categories you might put stories into, crime and drugs together accounted for more stories than the rest. Put together. You know, Ireland didn't fall apart in 1996. There was Veronica Guerin, a journalist, was murdered that year, and there was a debate about bail and a huge debate about tackling organised crime. And because Veronica Guerin worked for the newspapers themselves decided that, and possibly justifiably so, that they would have to do something about this national disgrace of organised crime. And that year, for no other reason that I can think of, the Evening Herald front pages were crime and drugs more than any other stories put together. I'll go through just when I sit down other newspapers, but basically there's always special attention paid to the judiciary. So when a judge says something extraordinary, it makes national headlines. You could say it and it wouldn't be anywhere. So we look at the courts and we look at crime and we look at the judiciary with a heightened sense of alertness, I suppose, or a heightened sense of sensibilities. And if a judge says something, it can be, judge says there'll be a tsunami of violence as a result of neck nominations, front page news in some newspapers. Judge doesn't show the sensitivity and concern maybe in half a sentence of his 800-line judgment, and it makes national news because a journalist decided to take it out of that 800-line judgment and use the half sentence. So there's always a special attention paid to courts and the judiciary because of that. And if you look at law and order, there's a program called Law and Order, or Crime and Punishment. There's a book called Crime and Punishment, I'm sure you've heard of it. I'd argue that if you leave religion aside, that's the greatest social construct, because I'm saying news is a social construct. I'm also telling you that Law and Order and Crime and Punishment, except for religion, are the greatest social construct that man has ever come up with, because both of them have a proscribed set of behaviours that we call laws. So we have a codified sense of what you can and can't do. So it's very structured. And we have prescribed solutions called punishments when you go outside the social norm. So does religion. You go to heaven, you go to hell, you go to the bit in between, whatever. You get masses said, whatever religion people are, or those of none, that, or whatever. And it might well be said that laws are based on what were originally religious beliefs. It might well be argued. But even in a secular society, you do have the social construct of law and order, prescribed activities, prescribed solutions, crime and punishment. And you put that together in your mind and you're thinking, isn't that just why it fits into the media? Isn't that why, above most other story types, crime and punishment and courts make it to the newspapers every day? Because the very act of journalism is a mediated, distilled, judgmental and social construction in itself. And every story you do is that. So I think the two of them together actually have a parallel existence, that there will always be tension between them, but they coexist and they're probably codependent, the two systems. And that's an argument that I'll throw in at the beginning, and I'll go back to the rest of it in a minute. I'll let you talk to me now for a while because I'm knackered. Right.
Thank you very much, Gerry. That's very good.